The pre-dawn briefing room fell silent as Captain Halle Morris watched the tactical display light up with hostile signatures. 25 enemy attack helicopters were closing in on Allied positions, and command was ordering a full retreat. But Morris had spent 2 years hiding what she could really do with an Apache, 2 years of holding back while male pilots got the glory missions. She looked at the retreat order on her screen, then at the enemy formation that would slaughter retreating ground forces. Her finger hovered over the radio switch. Some rules existed to be broken, especially when breaking them was the only way to save lives. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The sun climbed over forward operating base Valkyrie as Halle Morris completed her 4th consecutive pre-flight check of the day. At 26 years old, she'd been flying Apache helicopters for 3 years, but you wouldn't know it from her mission assignments. While other pilots in her squadron racked up combat hours and commendations, she flew reconnaissance patrols and equipment transfers, the aviation equivalent of filing paperwork. She stood barely 5'4", with a slight build that made her look more like a university student than a combat pilot. Her European accent, a blend of her British mother and German father, had softened during her years in the military, but it still marked her as different. The other pilots called her Little Bird behind her back, though never with the affection the nickname might suggest. Base Valkyrie sat in a contested region where 3 territorial disputes converged, making it a strategic flashpoint. The Apache squadron stationed there represented the primary air defense capability for thousands of ground troops operating in the surrounding valleys. It was serious work, life-and-death responsibility, and Halle had been desperate to prove herself capable of handling it since the day she arrived. But Lieutenant Colonel Davis, the squadron commander, had other ideas about her capabilities. During her initial evaluation, he'd watched her demonstration flight with obvious skepticism, his arms crossed over his chest as she executed every maneuver with textbook precision. When she landed, his only comment was that she'd done adequately for someone with her physical limitations. Physical limitations. The words had burned then and still burn now, 2 years later. The Apache helicopter didn't care about her height or weight. The sophisticated weapons systems responded to skill and training, not muscle mass. But Davis and most of the other pilots seemed convinced that combat aviation required some indefinable masculine quality that Halle simply lacked. The evidence suggested otherwise, at least to anyone paying attention. During training exercises, Halle consistently outperformed her peers in target acquisition and weapons accuracy. Her tactical assessments were detailed and precise. She could fly in conditions that grounded less skilled pilots. None of it mattered. When real missions came up, the ones with actual enemy contact, she was always assigned to support roles. Her weapons officer, Sergeant Riley Thompson, was one of the few people who'd seen what she could actually do. During a training exercise 6 months ago, they'd been jumped by aggressor aircraft playing the role of enemy fighters. The exercise parameters called for them to evade and return to base, but Halle had instead executed a series of maneuvers that put them in perfect firing position. If the weapons had been live, they would have achieved 3 kills in under 90 seconds. Thompson had been stunned. "Where did you learn to fly like that?" he asked after they landed. Halle simply smiled and changed the subject. The truth was complicated. She'd grown up around aircraft, her father having been a civilian helicopter pilot in Germany. She'd started flying at 16, had logged thousands of hours before joining the military. But more than that, she'd studied combat aviation with an obsession that bordered on unhealthy. Every night after her official duties ended, Halle retreated to her quarters and studied. Not the standard tactical manuals that everyone read, but historical analyses of aerial combat, physics papers on rotor dynamics, classified after-action reports she wasn't technically supposed to have access to. She'd developed a mental library of tactics and techniques that went far beyond standard military doctrine. She practiced too, using the flight simulators during off hours, running scenarios that the other pilots considered too difficult or too unrealistic. She flew against simulated enemies that outnumbered her 5-1, that had superior positioning, that used tactics designed to overwhelm and destroy, and she won. Not every time, but far more often than probabilities suggested she should. None of this preparation was visible to her commanders. They saw a small woman who flew adequate reconnaissance missions and never caused problems. They didn't see the hundreds of hours of additional training, the theoretical knowledge that exceeded that of pilots twice her age, the tactical creativity that could turn desperate situations into victories. Halle had learned to hide her capabilities because showing them only seemed to create resentment and suspicion. The supply run took most of the morning, flying a circuit between the main base and 3 forward positions. It was boring, mindless work that required minimal skill, exactly the kind of assignment that made Halle question why she'd spent years training to fly one of the most sophisticated combat helicopters ever built. Thompson maintained professional silence in the weapons officer seat behind her, but she could feel his frustration matching her own. As they approached the 3rd drop point, the radio crackled with increasing urgency. Multiple contacts had been spotted in the northern sector, exactly where intelligence had predicted. The defensive plan was being activated, with Apache pairs being vectored toward potential threat access. Halle listened to the chatter while unloading ammunition crates, hearing the tension in the other pilots' voices as they moved into position. By noon, they'd completed the supply run and were returning to base when the radio traffic shifted from tense to chaotic. The enemy offensive had begun, but not the way anyone had predicted. Instead of a ground assault supported by helicopters, the enemy had launched a massive air attack. Their helicopters were hitting Allied positions in waves, overwhelming the defensive positions faster than friendly aircraft could respond. Valkyrie actual, this is Hawk 3. We're engaged with multiple enemy helicopters. We count at least 15. Repeat, 15 hostile aircraft. We need support immediately. The voice belonged to Captain Wheeler, and Halle could hear the stress beneath his normally confident tone. She checked her tactical display and saw the situation developing in real time. Wheeler and his wingmen were outnumbered 7-1, with more enemy aircraft joining the fight every minute. Hawk 3, maintain defensive posture. Support is en route. Davis's voice came over the command channel, but Halle could hear the uncertainty in it. The squadron had been spread thin by the defensive plan, and concentrating forces would take time that Wheeler and the others didn't have. More voices joined the radio chaos. Ground units were reporting being strafed by enemy helicopters. Forward positions were requesting immediate air support. The entire northern sector was collapsing under the aerial assault, and the Apache squadron was scattered across 50 miles of territory, unable to concentrate their forces quickly enough to make a difference. Halle's hands tightened on the controls as she monitored the tactical situation. The enemy had executed a brilliant strategy, using feints and diversions to lure the Apache squadron out of position, then launching their main attack into the gap created. If something didn't change in the next 10 minutes, dozens of soldiers on the ground were going to die, and several Apache crews along with them. Morris, return to base and stand by for further orders. Davis's command came through clearly, relegating her to the sidelines once again. She was 40 miles south of the main battle, too far away to make a difference even if she was authorized to engage, which she wasn't. Supply pilots didn't get involved in combat operations. She could see the whole tactical picture on her display now. The enemy had committed approximately 25 attack helicopters to the offensive, an overwhelming force against the scattered friendly aircraft. They were operating in coordinated teams, using sophisticated tactics that suggested extensive training. This wasn't a ragtag insurgent force. This was a professional military operation designed to annihilate Allied air power. Captain Morris, Thompson's voice came through the internal comms, carefully neutral. We're equipped for combat, full weapons load, and we're actually closer to the main enemy formation than any other friendly aircraft. Halle glanced at her weapon status. Thompson was right. They'd been loaded for a combat patrol before being reassigned to supply duty, and nobody had bothered to remove the Hellfire missiles and rockets. They were carrying enough firepower to engage multiple targets. She pulled up the navigation display and calculated vectors. If they turned north immediately and went to full speed, they could reach the enemy's main formation in 8 minutes. The formation was concentrated, focused on overwhelming the 2 friendly Apaches in the area. They wouldn't expect a threat from the south, especially not from a single helicopter that was supposed to be running supplies. Halle stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities. Everything in her training said to follow orders, return to base, wait for instructions. But everything in her soul screamed that waiting meant watching people die when she had the capability to do something about it. The enemy formation was vulnerable right now, concentrated and focused on a single objective. In 10 minutes, they'd disperse and become much harder to engage. Her father had once told her that rules existed to create order, but that blind obedience to rules in the face of obvious catastrophe was cowardice, not discipline. She'd never forgotten that conversation, had never quite reconciled it with military hierarchy and chain of command. Now, watching Allied aircraft being overwhelmed and ground forces being massacred, she understood what he'd meant. Halle Morris had spent 2 years hiding her capabilities, following orders, staying in her assigned lane. She'd been the good soldier, the compliant pilot, the woman who didn't make waves or challenge decisions. And what had it gotten her? A front-row seat to disaster, while people died because the decision-makers couldn't see past her height and gender. Her hand moved to the controls almost without conscious thought, banking the Apache hard to the north. Thompson tensed behind her. "Captain, what are you doing? We have orders to return to base." "Change of plans," Halle replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "We're engaging. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative." The supply run took most of the morning, flying a circuit between the main base and 3 forward positions. It was boring, mindless work that required minimal skill, exactly the kind of assignment that made Halle question why she'd spent years training to fly one of the most sophisticated combat helicopters ever built. Thompson maintained professional silence in the weapons officer's seat behind her, but she could feel his frustration matching her own. As they approached the 3rd drop point, the radio crackled with increasing urgency. Multiple contacts had been spotted in the northern sector, exactly where intelligence had predicted. The defensive plan was being activated, with Apache pairs being vectored toward potential threat axes. Halle listened to the chatter while unloading ammunition crates, hearing the tension in the other pilots' voices as they moved into position. By noon, they'd completed the supply run and were returning to base when the radio traffic shifted from tense to chaotic. The enemy offensive had begun, but not the way anyone had predicted. Instead of a ground assault supported by helicopters, the enemy had launched a massive air attack. Their helicopters were hitting Allied positions in waves, overwhelming the defensive positions faster than friendly aircraft could respond. "Valkyrie actual, this is Hawk 3. We're engaged with multiple enemy helicopters. We count at least 15. Repeat, 1-5 hostile aircraft. We need support immediately." The voice belonged to Captain Wheeler, and Halle could hear the stress beneath his normally confident tone. She checked her tactical display and saw the situation developing in real time. Wheeler and his wingman were outnumbered 7-1, with more enemy aircraft joining the fight every minute. "Hawk 3, maintain defensive posture. Support is en route." Davis's voice came over the command channel, but Halle could hear the uncertainty in it. The squadron had been spread thin by the defensive plan, and concentrating forces would take time that Wheeler and the others didn't have. More voices joined the radio chaos. Ground units were reporting being strafed by enemy helicopters. Forward positions were requesting immediate air support. The entire northern sector was collapsing under the aerial assault, and the Apache squadron was scattered across 50 miles of territory, unable to concentrate their forces quickly enough to make a difference. Halle's hands tightened on the controls as she monitored the tactical situation. The enemy had executed a brilliant strategy, using feints and diversions to lure the Apache squadron out of position, then launching their main attack into the gap created. If something didn't change in the next 10 minutes, dozens of soldiers on the ground were going to die, and several Apache crews along with them. Morris, return to base and stand by for further orders. Davis's command came through clearly, relegating her to the sidelines once again. She was 40 miles south of the main battle, too far away to make a difference even if she was authorized to engage, which she wasn't. Supply pilots didn't get involved in combat operations. She could see the whole tactical picture on her display now. The enemy had committed approximately 25 attack helicopters to the offensive, an overwhelming force against the scattered friendly aircraft. They were operating in coordinated teams, using sophisticated tactics that suggested extensive training. This wasn't a ragtag insurgent force. This was a professional military operation designed to annihilate Allied air power. "Captain Morris," Thompson's voice came through the internal comms, carefully neutral. "We're equipped for combat, full weapons load, and we're actually closer to the main enemy formation than any other friendly aircraft." Halle glanced at her weapon status. Thompson was right. They'd been loaded for a combat patrol before being reassigned to supply duty, and nobody had bothered to remove the Hellfire missiles and rockets. They were carrying enough firepower to engage multiple targets. She pulled up the navigation display and calculated vectors. If they turned north immediately and went to full speed, they could reach the enemy's main formation in 8 minutes. The formation was concentrated, focused on overwhelming the 2 friendly Apaches in the area. They wouldn't expect a threat from the south, especially not from a single helicopter that was supposed to be running supplies. Halle stared at the tactical display, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities. Everything in her training said to follow orders, return to base, wait for instructions. But everything in her soul screamed that waiting meant watching people die when she had the capability to do something about it. The enemy formation was vulnerable right now, concentrated and focused on a single objective. In 10 minutes, they'd disperse and become much harder to engage. Her father had once told her that rules existed to create order, but that blind obedience to rules in the face of obvious catastrophe was cowardice, not discipline. She'd never forgotten that conversation, had never quite reconciled it with military hierarchy and chain of command. Now, watching Allied aircraft being overwhelmed and ground forces being massacred, she understood what he meant. Halle Morris had spent 2 years hiding her capabilities, following orders, staying in her assigned lane. She'd been the good soldier, the compliant pilot, the woman who didn't make waves or challenge decisions. And what had it gotten her? A front-row seat to disaster while people died because the decision-makers couldn't see past her height and gender. Her hand moved to the controls almost without conscious thought, banking the Apache hard to the north. Thompson tensed behind her. "Captain, what are you doing? We have orders to return to base." "Change of plans," Halle replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "We're engaging. We have invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative." "Captain, we don't have authorization to engage." Thompson's voice carried professional concern, not fear. "If we do this, there's no going back." "I know," Halle replied, pushing the Apache to maximum speed. The helicopter surged forward, the turbines screaming as they accelerated toward the battle zone. "Monitor enemy frequencies. I want to know their formation structure and communication patterns." Thompson switched to monitoring mode, his professional training overriding his concerns about protocol. "They're using standard attack formations, 3 ship elements with overlapping fields of fire. Communication discipline is good. These aren't amateurs, Captain." "Good," Halle said quietly. "That means they'll follow predictable tactical patterns." She pulled up the terrain mapping system and began plotting an approach vector that would use the mountain ridges to mask their advance. The enemy formation was concentrated in a valley, focused on overwhelming Wheeler and his wingmen. They had established air superiority and were operating with the confidence that came from numerical advantage. What Halle understood, what her years of obsessive study had taught her, was that numerical advantage became a liability when forces were concentrated in confined terrain. The enemy helicopters were operating in close proximity, maintaining formations that looked impressive but limited their individual maneuverability. They were strong, but inflexible. She keyed the radio to the emergency frequency. "Hawk 3, this is Valkyrie 7. We're approaching from your south. When I engage, break contact and reposition to the eastern ridgeline."
Wheeler's response came back immediately, confusion evident in his voice. "Valkyrie 7, you're not authorized for combat operations. Return to base immediately." "Negative, Hawk 3. You're about to be overrun. I'm engaging in 30 seconds. Be ready to move." Halle switched off the radio before Wheeler could argue further. She didn't need permission, didn't need approval. She needed Wheeler alive and out of the kill zone before she executed what she was about to attempt. The Apache crested the final ridge, and suddenly the entire battle spread out before them. 25 enemy helicopters filled the valley, their formations geometrically precise as they concentrated fire on Wheeler's position. Smoke trails from missiles crisscrossed the air, and the chatter of chain guns created a constant thunder. It was beautiful and terrible, a display of coordinated military power that was about to destroy 2 Allied aircraft. Thompson's breath caught as he saw the enemy numbers. "Captain, that's 5-to-1 odds at minimum. This is suicide." "Then pay attention," Halle said calmly, selecting her first targets. "You're about to learn something they don't teach in flight school." She dove toward the enemy formation from above and behind, using the sun and terrain to mask her approach. The first 4 enemy helicopters never knew what killed them. Halle fired Hellfire missiles in rapid succession, each one tracking to a different target with lethal precision. The missiles covered the distance in seconds, and 4 attack helicopters exploded simultaneously, their debris raining into the valley below. The enemy formation convulsed in confusion. They'd been focused entirely forward, never expecting a threat from behind. Halle used those precious seconds of chaos to reposition, sliding the Apache sideways through a gap in the ridgeline while Thompson reloaded weapon systems. "Contact rear!" An enemy pilot's voice screamed over the radio frequency Thompson was monitoring. "Single hostile aircraft engaging from the south. All units break formation and engage."
The valley had transformed into chaos. Enemy helicopters scattered in all directions, some trying to form defensive positions, others fleeing toward the safety of their own territory. Halle pursued them with methodical efficiency, using terrain masking and superior maneuverability to maintain the advantage of surprise. She'd studied these tactics for years, had run simulations of exactly this scenario dozens of times. The enemy pilots were skilled, but they were executing standard doctrine against someone who'd memorized every counter tactic ever developed. Wheeler and his wingmen had repositioned to the eastern ridge as instructed, and now they rejoined the fight with renewed energy. The odds had shifted from overwhelming enemy advantage to something approaching even terms. 3 Allied Apaches against 21 remaining enemy aircraft. But those 21 were confused, leaderless, and facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Halle targeted enemy helicopters with surgical precision, prioritizing threats based on position and capability. She avoided the temptation to simply fire at the nearest target, instead selecting aircraft that were trying to coordinate the scattered formation. Every enemy pilot who attempted to rally their forces found themselves in her crosshairs within seconds. The radio spectrum erupted with enemy communications, panic replacing their earlier professional discipline. "They're everywhere. How many hostile aircraft are engaging? We need air support immediately." The voices overlapped, creating a symphony of confusion that Halle used to track enemy positions and anticipate their movements. Thompson had stopped questioning her tactics and was functioning purely as her weapons officer, feeding her target data and managing ammunition with impressive efficiency. "Hellfire away, tracking true," he called out mechanically. "Target destroyed. Reloading. Next target marked." An enemy helicopter managed to get into firing position, launching missiles toward Halle's aircraft. She'd seen the threat developing seconds earlier and had already initiated evasive maneuvers. The Apache twisted through the air in ways that seemed to violate physics, chaff and flares blooming behind them as the enemy missiles lost lock and detonated harmlessly against the mountainside. She used the momentum from the evasive maneuver to position herself above the attacking helicopter, firing rockets in a tight salvo that shredded the enemy aircraft. Debris scattered across the valley floor. 12 enemy helicopters destroyed now, and the survivors were beginning to realize they weren't facing a lucky pilot, but someone far beyond their capability to counter. The enemy formation finally broke completely. The remaining helicopters abandoned any pretense of coordinated tactics and fled north toward their own territory. Halle considered pursuit, but checked her ammunition status. They were running low on missiles, and extended pursuit would leave them vulnerable. She keyed the radio to Wheeler's frequency. "Hawk 3, this is Valkyrie 7. Enemy air formation is retreating. Regroup with me at coordinates I'm transmitting now. Willa's response came after a moment's pause. Valkyrie 7, understood. Captain Morris, that was the most incredible flying I've ever witnessed. Save it, Halle said curtly. We still have work to do. The three Apaches formed up in a defensive triangle, scanning for any enemy aircraft that might attempt to return. The valley below was littered with burning wreckage, testimony to the violence of the engagement. Halle conducted a quick systems check, noting battle damage from near misses but nothing critical. Base Valkyrie, this is Valkyrie 7. Reporting, enemy air assault has been repelled. Multiple hostile aircraft destroyed. Friendly aircraft are operational and returning to base. The radio silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Davis's voice came through, tight with barely controlled emotion. Valkyrie 7, you were ordered to return to base, not engage enemy forces. I made a tactical decision based on the situation developing in real time, Halle replied, keeping her voice neutral. Hawk 3 was about to be overrun, and I was in position to provide support. That was not your decision to make, Captain Morris. Return to base immediately. You're grounded pending investigation.
The flight back to base Valkyrie felt longer than the combat engagement. Halle maintained radio silence except for required check-ins, processing what she'd just done and what it would mean for her career. She'd violated direct orders, engaged in combat without authorization, and effectively declared herself judge of tactical necessity over her commanding officer. By any standard military measure, she'd committed serious breaches of discipline that could result in court-martial. But she'd also saved Wheeler and his wingmen from certain death, had single-handedly broken an enemy offensive that would have devastated Allied positions, and had destroyed at least 12 enemy helicopters with precision that demonstrated skill far beyond what anyone at the base thought she possessed. The contradiction sat heavily in her chest as the base came into view. Thompson broke the internal calm silence as they approached for landing. Captain, whatever happens next, I want you to know that was the most professional flying I've ever experienced. You saved a lot of lives today. Thank you, Sergeant, Halle replied quietly. I just hope Command sees it the same way. The landing pad was crowded with personnel when they touched down. Halle could see Lieutenant Colonel Davis waiting, his posture rigid with anger. Next to him stood several other officers she recognized from base command, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed fury. This was going to be worse than she'd anticipated. She shut down the Apache systems methodically, going through her post-flight checklist with the same careful attention she gave every landing. If this was her last flight, she was going to end it properly. Thompson climbed out first, immediately surrounded by other crew chiefs wanting to examine the aircraft and hear about the engagement. Halle descended from the cockpit to find Davis waiting, his face flushed with anger. Captain Morris, you are relieved of flight status effective immediately. Surrender your weapon and report to the command building for debriefing. You're confined to quarters pending investigation into your actions. Yes, sir, Halle replied, unstrapping her sidearm and handing it to the military police sergeant who had accompanied Davis. As she was escorted toward the command building, she noticed Wheeler and his wingmen landing at the far end of the field. Wheeler gave her a salute that Davis didn't see, a gesture of respect that made the impending discipline slightly easier to bear. The debriefing lasted 4 hours. Halle sat across from Davis and 2 other senior officers, recounting every detail of her unauthorized engagement while they took notes and occasionally interrupted with pointed questions. She didn't try to justify her actions or minimize her breach of orders. She simply explained her tactical reasoning and the split-second decisions that had led to the enemy formation's destruction. When she finished, the senior officers excused her and huddled in discussion. Halle waited outside the command building, watching the sun set over the mountains while her career likely ended in the room behind her. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had accepted it as the price for refusing to be limited by others' perceptions. She just hadn't expected it to arrive quite so dramatically. Thompson found her an hour later bringing coffee and news from the flight line. The aircraft's gun camera footage was being analyzed. Apparently, you destroyed 13 enemy helicopters, not 12. One you counted as probable was confirmed destroyed by the recovery teams. 13, Halle repeated softly. That's quite a number for someone not authorized for combat operations.
The night passed slowly in her quarters. Halle had been confined but not arrested, a distinction that suggested command was uncertain how to proceed. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the engagement in her mind and analyzing what she could have done differently. The tactical execution had been nearly flawless, but the decision to disobey orders remained questionable by any military standard. At 0600 hours, a knock at her door interrupted her restless thoughts. An aide informed her that she was to report to Lieutenant Colonel Davis's office immediately in dress uniform. The formalities suggested something significant was about to happen, though whether it was court-martial proceedings or something else remained unclear. She dressed carefully, ensuring every detail of her uniform was perfect. If she was going to face judgment, she would do it looking like the professional soldier she'd always tried to be. The walk to Davis's office felt surreal, other personnel watching her pass with expressions ranging from admiration to condemnation. Davis's office was crowded when she entered. Besides the squadron commander, there were several officers she didn't recognize. Their rank insignia indicated they'd come from regional command. Wheeler was present too, along with Thompson and several other pilots from the engagement. The assembled group created an atmosphere more suited to a tribunal than a routine debriefing. "Captain Morris," Davis began, his tone formal and controlled. "Yesterday, you disobeyed direct orders, engaged enemy forces without authorization, and conducted combat operations outside your designated role. These actions constitute serious breaches of military discipline." "Yes, sir," Halle replied, standing at attention. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." One of the unfamiliar officers stepped forward, a colonel whose nameplate reads Patterson. "Captain Morris, I'm Colonel Patterson from Regional Air Command. I've spent the night reviewing gun camera footage from your engagement, analyzing tactical data, and interviewing witnesses. Your flying was extraordinary." "Thank you, sir," Halle said carefully, unsure where this was leading. "It was also completely insubordinate," Patterson continued. "You made decisions that weren't yours to make, ignored the chain of command, and put yourself at considerable risk without authorization. In doing so, you saved the lives of at least 4 Allied pilots, prevented the destruction of 3 Apache helicopters worth millions of dollars each, and broke an enemy offensive that would have resulted in significant casualties among ground forces." The room fell silent. Patterson studied Halle with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The question we've been debating since last night is whether you're a dangerous maverick who can't be trusted to follow orders, or an exceptional pilot who was criminally underutilized by her command structure." Wheeler spoke up from his position near the wall. "Sir, if I may, Captain Morris saved my life yesterday. She executed tactics I didn't think were possible and demonstrated combat capability that exceeds anyone I've ever flown with. Her actions were insubordinate, but they were also necessary." Davis's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Patterson nodded slowly, then turned back to Halle. "Captain Morris, why did you hide your capabilities for 2 years? Why not demonstrate what you could do through proper channels?" Halle considered her answer carefully. "Sir, I didn't hide my capabilities. I demonstrated them repeatedly during training exercises. What I hid was my frustration at never being given opportunities to use those capabilities in situations that mattered." Patterson's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes. "You're saying your command structure failed to utilize your abilities appropriately?" Halle chose her words carefully. "Sir, I'm saying that I was never given opportunities that matched my training and capabilities. When I demonstrated advanced skills during exercises, they were dismissed as anomalies. When I offered tactical suggestions, they were ignored. I spent 2 years proving I could handle combat operations while being assigned supply runs." Davis's face reddened. Captain Morris, you were assigned duties appropriate to your experience level and physical parameters. Combat aviation requires more than just technical proficiency, it requires judgment, which you clearly lack given your actions yesterday. With respect, sir, Halle replied, her voice steady. My judgment yesterday saved lives and prevented a strategic defeat. I calculated the risks, assessed the tactical situation, and executed a plan that succeeded. The fact that I did so without authorization doesn't change the outcome. The room erupted in murmured conversations. Patterson raised the hand for silence. Captain Morris, let me be direct. Your unauthorized engagement destroyed 13 confirmed enemy helicopters. The gun camera footage shows tactical execution that borders on genius. You exploited terrain, used enemy communication patterns against them, and maintained situational awareness that most pilots couldn't achieve with full command support. Where did you learn to fly like that? Halle hesitated, then decided honesty was her only option. Sir, I've spent every night for 2 years studying aerial combat tactics, running simulator scenarios, and analyzing historical engagements. I prepared myself for combat operations because I believed I would eventually get the opportunity to prove my capabilities. Yesterday, that opportunity arrived. Without authorization, Davis interjected sharply. She took matters into her own hands because she thought she knew better than her commanding officer. That's not initiative, that's insubordination. Wheeler stepped forward again. Sir, if I may, I was in that valley yesterday watching my wingmen take hits and knowing we had minutes before we were overwhelmed. Captain Morris appeared from nowhere and executed a rescue that I didn't think was possible. She didn't just engage the enemy, she destroyed their entire formation using tactics I've never seen before. If that's insubordination, then maybe we need to reconsider what we value in our combat pilots. Thompson added his perspective. Colonel Patterson, I was Captain Morris's weapons officer during the engagement. She maintained perfect communication, executed maneuvers that required split-second timing, and demonstrated spatial awareness that kept us alive against overwhelming odds. She never panicked, never hesitated, and never made a mistake. That level of performance doesn't happen by accident. Patterson studied Halle for a long moment, then turned to Davis. Lieutenant Colonel, it appears you've had one of the most naturally gifted combat pilots I've ever encountered flying supply runs for 2 years. Would you care to explain how that happened? Davis's jaw worked silently. She never demonstrated this level of capability during standard operations. How was I supposed to know she could perform at this level under combat conditions? Perhaps by actually testing her under combat conditions, Patterson replied dryly. Captain Morris, I'm placing you on temporary assignment to Regional Command while we sort out what to do with you. You're not being court-martialed, but you're not being commended either. Your actions saved lives, but they also violated fundamental military discipline. We need to find an appropriate response that acknowledges both realities.
The temporary assignment to Regional Command placed Halle in a strange limbo. She wasn't flying, wasn't facing formal charges, but also wasn't returned to her squadron. Instead, she spent her days in briefing rooms, while senior officers debated her fate and analyzed every second of her unauthorized engagement. The gun camera footage had been reviewed by tactical analysts from 3 different commands, each reaching the same conclusion. Her flying represented a level of skill rarely seen in combat aviation. But skill wasn't the issue. The issue was authority, chain of command, and the precedent her actions might set if not properly addressed. If pilots could simply decide for themselves when orders should be ignored, the entire military structure would collapse into chaos. Yet if exceptional performance under crisis conditions was punished rather than recognized, what message did that send about initiative and tactical judgment? Wheeler visited her quarters on the 3rd day of her reassignment, bringing news from the squadron. The other pilots are talking about what you did. Half of them think you're a hero, the other half think you're dangerous. Davis is furious, but he's also been questioned pretty intensively about why he had you flying supplies instead of combat missions. Halle sat on her bunk, tired from another day of interrogations, disguised as debriefings. I didn't do it to be a hero, Wheeler. I did it because you were going to die if someone didn't act. The fact that I violated orders doing it doesn't change that reality. I know, Wheeler replied. And for what it's worth, thank you. I owe you my life, and so does my wingman. Whatever happens with command, that debt doesn't go away. He paused, then added, there's something else you should know. The enemy has put out intelligence communications about the engagement. They're calling you the ghost pilot. Apparently, they think multiple aircraft were involved because they can't believe one pilot destroyed that many helicopters. Halle almost smiled at that. I suppose being underestimated has some advantages. They built their tactics around assumptions about capability that turned out to be wrong. That's the same mistake Davis made, just from the opposite direction. The following morning, Halle was summoned to a meeting with Colonel Patterson and 2 other senior officers she hadn't met before. They sat around a conference table covered with tactical maps and analysis reports, their expressions serious but not hostile. Captain Morris, Patterson began, we've completed our review of your actions. Before we discuss our conclusions, I want to ask you a direct question. If you were in the same situation again, with the same information and the same orders to return to base, would you make the same choice? Halle didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Saving lives takes precedence over following orders when those orders would result in preventable deaths. I would make the same tactical decision, accept the same consequences, and live with the same outcome. Even knowing those consequences might include court-martial and the end of your career? Yes, sir. Because the alternative is living with the knowledge that I let people die when I had the capability to save them. I didn't join the military to watch from the sidelines while others fight. I joined to serve. And sometimes that means making difficult decisions. One of the other officers, a general whose nameplate read Harrison, leaned forward. Captain Morris, your file shows exceptional technical proficiency, but minimal command experience. You've never led a mission, never been responsible for other pilots, never had to make decisions that affect entire operations. Yet you took it upon yourself to override your commanding officer's tactical plan and execute your own. That shows either remarkable courage or dangerous arrogance. Sir, with respect, Halle replied, I didn't override a tactical plan. Lieutenant Colonel Davis's plan had already failed. The enemy had broken through our defensive positions and was destroying our aircraft. I improvised a response to a situation that his plan hadn't anticipated.
General Harrison exchanged glances with Patterson before responding. Captain Morris, we've interviewed Lieutenant Colonel Davis extensively about his command decisions. While your actions were technically insubordinate, our analysis suggests his defensive plan had significant flaws that contributed to the crisis you responded to. He spread your squadron too thin, failed to maintain adequate reserves, and didn't anticipate the enemy's concentration of force. Halle remained silent, uncertain where this line of discussion was leading. Harrison continued, We've also reviewed your service record in detail. Every training exercise, every evaluation, every report filed by your instructors and supervisors. What we found was interesting. Your technical scores were consistently exceptional, but your assignments were consistently minimal. Can you explain that discrepancy? Sir, I believe my physical appearance created assumptions about my capabilities that influenced assignment decisions. I'm smaller than most pilots, female, and speak with an accent that marks me as foreign-born. Those factors combine to create perceptions that I wasn't suited for combat roles, regardless of my actual performance. Patterson picked up a document from the table. This is your initial evaluation from flight school. Your instructor wrote, and I quote, Cadet Morris demonstrates exceptional natural ability and tactical understanding far beyond her peers. She should be fast-tracked for advanced combat training. But you weren't fast-tracked, were you? No, sir. I was assigned to standard progression with a note in my file questioning whether I had the physical strength for sustained combat operations. Halle paused, then added, "The instructor who questioned my strength was overruled by a supervisor who never actually observed my flying." Harrison nodded slowly. "We're seeing a pattern here, Captain. A pattern of exceptional ability being systematically undervalued because of factors unrelated to actual performance. Your unauthorized engagement yesterday forced us to confront that pattern and question whether our evaluation methods are identifying talent or reinforcing biases." The room fell silent. Halle processed what she was hearing, trying to understand whether this was leading toward vindication or a more sophisticated form of criticism. Finally, Patterson spoke. "Captain Morris, we're not going to court-martial you. Your actions, while insubordinate, were tactically sound and resulted in a significant strategic victory. However, we're also not going to simply excuse the breach of discipline and pretend it didn't happen. Instead, we're offering you a choice. You can return to your squadron with a formal reprimand on your record, acknowledging your breach of orders while recognizing the positive outcome. You'll continue flying Apaches, but under closer supervision. Or you can accept a transfer to a newly formed tactical development unit that's being created to analyze and implement advanced combat techniques. That assignment would effectively make you a test pilot and tactical instructor, working directly with pilots from multiple squadrons." Halle considered the options carefully. The first would return her to familiar territory, but with a damaged record and likely continued skepticism from her command structure. The second would remove her from frontline operations, but give her influence over how pilots were trained and tactics were developed. "What would my role be in this tactical development unit?" General Harrison answered, "You'd be evaluating new combat techniques, developing training scenarios, and working with promising pilots to expand their tactical capabilities. Essentially, you'd be doing what you've been doing for yourself for 2 years, but on behalf of the entire command. Your unauthorized engagement demonstrated capabilities we want to understand and potentially replicate." "Would I still fly combat missions?" Halle asked. That was the crucial question. She hadn't spent years preparing herself for combat just to become a full-time instructor. Patterson nodded. "You'd fly regularly, both for testing purposes and for actual missions when your specific skills are required. But you'd also be developing the next generation of combat pilots, sharing the knowledge you've accumulated. Think of it as expanding your impact beyond what you can accomplish in a single aircraft."
Halle took 48 hours to consider the offer, though she knew almost immediately what her answer would be. The Tactical Development Unit represented an opportunity to influence combat aviation on a scale far beyond individual missions. She could help other pilots avoid the years of frustration she'd experienced, could push for evaluation methods that identified capability rather than reinforcing bias, could ensure that exceptional talent wasn't wasted because it came in unexpected packages. When she returned to Colonel Patterson's office with her decision, she found Wheeler waiting along with Thompson and several other pilots from Base Valkyrie. Patterson explained their presence immediately. "Captain Morris, if you accept the tactical development assignment, these pilots have volunteered to be your first students. They want to learn the techniques you demonstrated during your engagement." Wheeler stepped forward. "Captain Morris, I've been flying Apaches for 8 years, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about combat tactics. Then I watched your gun camera footage and realized I've been operating at maybe 60% of what's actually possible with these aircraft. If you're willing to teach, I'm willing to learn." Thompson added his perspective. "Ma'am, I've been a weapons officer for 6 years with a dozen different pilots. Working with you during that engagement showed me what's possible when a pilot operates at the absolute limits of capability. I'd like to be part of whatever unit you're building." Halle looked at the assembled pilots, seeing respect where there had been dismissal, eagerness where there had been skepticism. These were the same men who'd called her Little Bird, who doubted her capabilities, who treated her as a mascot rather than a colleague. Now they wanted to learn from her,
to expand their own capabilities by studying what she'd accomplished. She turned to Patterson. "Sir, I accept the assignment to the Tactical Development Unit, but I have conditions. First, evaluations must be based purely on performance metrics, not on physical characteristics or demographic factors. Second, any pilot who demonstrates exceptional capability must be given opportunities to prove themselves in actual operations, not relegated to support roles. Third, I want authority to identify and recruit promising pilots regardless of their current assignments." Patterson smiled slightly. "Those conditions align with the mandate we're giving the unit. General Harrison and I have spent considerable time discussing how combat aviation has evolved and whether our evaluation methods have kept pace. Your unauthorized engagement forced us to confront some uncomfortable questions about how we identify and develop talent. Consider your conditions accepted." Over the following weeks, the Tactical Development Unit took shape. Halle was promoted to the rank of major and given command of a small but elite group of pilots and weapons officers. They operated from a secure facility adjacent to Base Valkyrie, with access to advanced simulators and dedicated aircraft for testing new techniques. The training program she developed was brutally challenging. She pushed her students beyond what they thought possible, forcing them to fly in conditions they'd previously avoided, to engage simulated enemies that outnumbered them dramatically, to think tactically in ways that standard doctrine didn't address. Some pilots washed out, unable to handle the mental and physical demands. But those who succeeded emerged as dramatically more capable aviators. Wheeler became her deputy commander, having demonstrated both exceptional flying ability and the humility to learn from someone he'd previously underestimated. Thompson served as the senior weapons officer, developing new employment techniques for the Apache's weapon systems that increased effectiveness by significant margins. Together, they created a training pipeline that transformed good pilots into exceptional ones. The unit's reputation spread quickly through the military aviation community. Pilots began requesting transfers, wanting to be part of the program that had produced such dramatic results. 6 months after its formation, the Tactical Development Unit had trained over 50 pilots, each of whom returned to their squadrons with capabilities that elevated their entire units.
3 years after her unauthorized engagement, Major Halle Morris stood in a ceremony hall receiving recognition she'd never expected. The Distinguished Flying Cross, awarded for extraordinary achievement in aerial combat. General Harrison presented the medal personally, speaking to an audience of senior officers and aviation personnel about the pilot who'd changed combat aviation through a combination of exceptional skill and courageous defiance. The medal felt heavy in Halle's hands, weighty with significance beyond its physical mass. It represented vindication for every time she'd been dismissed as too small, too weak, too female to matter in combat operations. But more than that, it represented a shift in how the military thought about capability and potential. Wheeler stood among the audience, now a lieutenant colonel commanding his own squadron. He'd become one of the program's most vocal advocates, frequently speaking about how Major Morris's training had transformed his understanding of what was possible in combat aviation. Thompson was there too, having been promoted and assigned as the senior weapons officer for the training command. After the ceremony, Halle found a quiet moment on the facility's observation deck, watching student pilots conduct training flights. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the overlooked logistics specialist to the commander reshaping combat aviation training. The path had been difficult, marked by frustration and dismissal, and the constant need to prove herself against assumptions that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. A young pilot approached hesitantly, a lieutenant who just completed the advanced program. "Major Morris, I wanted to thank you. I was told I'd never fly combat missions because I didn't fit the profile. Your program gave me the chance to prove what I could do." Halle smiled at the lieutenant, seeing in her the same determination and hunger for opportunity that had driven her own career. That's what this program exists for, to give people chances to prove themselves based on capability, not stereotypes. Make the most of it. The lieutenant saluted and departed,
leaving Halle alone with her thoughts. She reflected on the unauthorized engagement that had changed everything, the moment when she decided that saving lives mattered more than following orders. The decision had nearly destroyed her career, but had ultimately transformed it into something far more significant than she had imagined possible. Her radio crackled with a priority alert. Emergency situation developing in the northern sector. Multiple friendly aircraft engaged with superior enemy forces. Request immediate tactical support. Halle was moving before the message finished, instincts honed by years of preparation taking over. Some things never changed. Crisis situations still required people willing to act decisively, to push beyond conventional limitations, to prove that exceptional capability could overcome impossible odds. She sprinted toward her personal Apache, the aircraft maintained specifically for command missions and emergency responses. Thompson was already prepping the systems, having heard the same alert. "Ready to fly, Major," he called out as she approached. Halle climbed into the cockpit, her hands moving across controls with the fluid certainty of thousands of hours of experience. "Let's show them how it's done," she said, bringing the engines online. The helicopter lifted smoothly, banking toward the coordinates where friendly forces needed assistance. 3 years after her unauthorized engagement, Halle Morris was still proving that size didn't determine strength, that conventional wisdom deserved to be challenged, and that sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was trust their own judgment and act decisively when lives hung in the balance. The Apache accelerated toward the battle zone, carrying a pilot who'd been underestimated, dismissed, and relegated to insignificance before proving that exceptional capability could exist in forms that defied expectation. Behind her, the training command she'd built continued preparing the next generation of aviators who would carry forward the lessons she'd demonstrated through both her unauthorized engagement and her subsequent career. Some rules existed to maintain order, but some rules existed to be broken when following them meant accepting preventable defeat. Halle Morris had learned to tell the difference, and in teaching others that distinction, she'd changed combat aviation forever. The battle ahead would test her skills once again, but she approached it with the confidence born of preparation, experience, and the absolute certainty that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest tactical advantage of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.